The moment I signed the deed to my dream lakefront property, I had no idea that what I really purchased was a front row seat to the most outrageous HOA war in town. But trust me, you're going to want to hear every second of this insanity. And if you've ever dealt with a power-drunk HOA board or a nosy neighbor with too much time and too little sense, you already know how quickly things can spiral. So before I take you deep into the madness of how they tried to steal my lake and how I turned the tables in the most epic way possible, hit that subscribe button and follow for more true HOA nightmares that will make you want to move off the grid. Now, let's go back to day one. The cabin I bought wasn't just any cabin. It was a quiet, tucked-away log home surrounded by whispering pine trees and backed up directly against a sparkling, serene lake that was so still in the mornings, it looked like polished glass. I grew up fishing with my grandfather and always dreamed of retiring early, leaving the noise behind, and waking up with a rod in one hand and a mug of black coffee in the other. That dream came true when I stumbled on a foreclosure listing for this lakeside parcel that was well below market value. What nobody seemed to realize, not even the local HOA that ran the surrounding subdivision, was that the lake, while appearing to be shared by the neighborhood, was actually almost entirely on my property and the land underneath their docks. That was mine too, according to the old dusty land survey that came with the deed. I moved in on a Monday. By Thursday morning, I'd already met the queen of the neighborhood HOA, President Karen Townsend, when she marched up to my front porch, uninvited, clipboard in hand, flanked by two other board members who looked like they hadn't smiled since 1987. She didn't bother with introductions. "We need to talk about your unauthorized use of the lake," she barked, as if I was a child who had snuck into the country club pool. I blinked. "My use of the lake," said, motioning toward the fishing pole leaning against the rail and the canoe tied to my dock. "This is my property. The lake is part of the parcel." Karen's eyes narrowed like she just smelled something rotten. "The lake is a community feature," she snapped. "It falls under HOA jurisdiction. All water access and management rights default to the association bylaws." That was her first mistake assuming. I hadn't done my research. I pulled out my phone and opened the PDF file of the official land survey that showed clear as day that the lake and the land beneath the water, extending out nearly 50 feet from my shoreline, were mine. Not leased, not shared, not public mine. I showed it to her, and instead of reading it, she snatched the phone out of my hand, scanned it for a half-second, then scoffed and handed it back. "We'll have to review this. But for now, you need to cease and desist all personal use of the lake," she said, then turned on her heel and stormed off like a dictator who'd just been questioned. I stood there, stunned. Who the hell just tells a homeowner to stop using their own lake? Over. The next week, things escalated fast. First came the violation notices. They were slid under my door, left on my windshield, and even taped to my mailbox each, one accusing me of unauthorized recreation, personal dock maintenance, and unapproved wildlife feeding. I laughed at first. It was some kind of prank. But the more they kept coming, the more it became clear they were dead serious. I decided to show up at the next HOA meeting, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see this circus in action. The room was full of retirees, soccer moms, and overly ambitious board members who treated the HOA like it was the Supreme Court. Karen stood at the podium like she was addressing Congress. "We have a serious issue regarding the misuse of common water features," she announced, two nods and murmurs. I raised my hand. "Excuse me," I said. "What?" "But the lake isn't a common feature. I own it, and I have the survey and deed to prove it. You would have thought I claimed to own the moon?" Karen's face turned red. "That land has always been community property. Your paperwork must be in error," she snapped. I calmly passed copies of my documents to each board member and even projected it on the wall using the room's smart TV. There it was, parcel lines, GPS coordinates, and legal notations showing my ownership of the lake and the submerged land where they're beloved. Community docks had been built years ago without permits or permissions. That was the moment the atmosphere in the room shifted. People looked at Karen with a mixture of confusion and concern. One of the older board members asked, Karen, did we ever check the deed before listing the lake and the amenities?
Eyes.
Karen stammered. We assumed it was public domain. You assumed? The man said. You didn't verify? I could have walked away right then with a smug grin. But I didn't, because things were about to get a whole lot worse and way more entertaining. 2 days later, a work crew showed up to my property unannounced. They were hauling buoys floating. Barriers and signage that read community use area. No private activity allowed. I came outside in my robe and slippers, coffee in hand. You guys lost? I asked. The foreman shrugged. We're just doing what the HOA paid us for. You're trespassing, I said, pointing to the boundary marker clearly posted. On the shore, unless you want a lawsuit, you'll turn that truck around. He hesitated, but then Karen herself showed up again, barking orders like a general on a battlefield. She told them to ignore me and start placing the markers in the water. That's when I had to show my hand. I walked inside, grabbed a copy of the court-approved cease and desist letter I had filed that morning with my attorney's help, and handed it to the foreman. It cited my property rights, the survey, and a temporary restraining order, barring the HOA from making any modifications or access claims until a judge could review the dispute. The crew backed off immediately, clearly not interested in becoming part of a lawsuit. Karen's jaw dropped. You're really taking this to court? You trespassed? You tried to claim ownership of my property? You sent goons onto my land? Without permission? You gave me no choice, I replied. And by the way, those docks your residents use? Every single one is on my land, and none of them are permitted. Her face paled. The first battle was won, but the war was just getting started. I expected things to calm down after I served the HOA with legal paperwork, but instead, they doubled down. It was like poking a hornet's nest with a cattle prod. By the following week, the entire neighborhood had received a special bulletin. Flyer from the HOA, filled with bold red fonts, dramatic phrasing, and a completely twisted version of the truth. New resident illegally claims ownership of community lake was the headline, followed by paragraphs accusing me of land theft, disruption of neighborhood unity, and even potential ecological harm due to my so-called unauthorized fishing. It was laughably, except some of the neighbors actually believed it. I had people I'd never met giving me the stink eye during morning walks. And one woman went so far as to take pictures of me from her porch while I trimmed the hedges, muttering something about gathering evidence. This wasn't just petty HOA drama anymore. It was turning into a neighborhood-wide smear campaign. But what they didn't know was that I had begun building my own army, quietly, methodically. See, there were others in the community who had been bullied by Karen and her inner circle for years. People who were fined for trivial things like planting non-regulation flowers, or having patio furniture that disrupted aesthetic cohesion. I met one elderly couple, Tim and Dolores, who told me they'd been forced to remove a handmade swing their grandson built because it posed a safety hazard. Another guy, Chris, had been fined weekly for parking his truck in his own driveway, apparently. Work vehicles weren't allowed in view, even if they were legally registered and on private property. These people were tired, frustrated, and ready to push back. Invited them over for a weekend barbecue, which I jokingly called the HOA Resistance Rally. We grilled burgers, shared horror stories, and I laid out the full extent of my legal documentation, property deeds, county records, even drone footage showing the docks clearly on my side of the property line. Most importantly, I showed them something that Karen clearly hadn't realized. The HOA bylaws had a clause that allowed for board members to be removed via special vote if a petition with at least 30% of homeowners' signatures was submitted. The idea caught fire. By Monday, we had volunteers going door to door, polite, professional, and armed with the truth. It wasn't about just me anymore. It was about ending years of rule by clipboard. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't sitting idle. She filed a formal complaint with the county claiming I had dammed a portion of the lake and was interfering with natural water flow. The accusation was absurd. I hadn't touched the shoreline beyond basic dock maintenance and cleaning, up the mess left by previous dock squatters, but the complaint triggered an inspection. 2 guys from the Department of Natural Resources showed up in a white pickup, clipboard in hand, serious expressions locked in place. I greeted them calmly, handed them coffee, and showed them around. Within 20 minutes, they saw there was no dam, no blockage, and no violations. But what they did find was far more interesting. Several of the community docks, particularly on the east side of the lake, had old rusted footings driven into submerged land without any permits or safety barriers. These wouldn't pass a modern inspection, one of them muttered, jotting notes. They left with a few photos and promised to file a report. Karen had tried to get me in trouble and had only succeeded in drawing official attention to her own illegal structures. The next day, I received a call from the HOA's own attorney. Not Karen, the actual lawyer for the association. He was calm, professional, and clearly more reasonable than the board president. "Mr. Hayes," he began, "we've reviewed the documentation and acknowledged that the lake and submerged land are indeed on your property. The HOA would like to propose a shared use agreement. After all the harassment, fines and slander, now they wanted to make a deal. Tell Karen she can either remove the docks within 30 days or start paying rent," I replied, backdated to the day I moved in. There was a long silence, then a cough. "Oh." "Convey the message," he said before hanging up. Word spread like wildfire. Apparently Karen didn't take the news well. At the next HOA meeting, which was packed wall to wall, she tried to spin it as a misunderstanding. I didn't attend that one, I had better things to do, but one of my neighbors recorded the entire thing. Karen stood at the podium with trembling hands, trying to explain how the property lines were confusing and how the community should focus on unity, not division, but her voice was drowned out by calls from the audience demanding her resignation. That same night, the petition to remove her hit over 40% of homeowners. The vote was scheduled for the following week. Meanwhile, I was busy fencing off parts of the lakeshore that connected to my property, not out of spite, but to finally take control of what I legally owned. I installed small, tasteful signs that read "Private property, no trespassing." That triggered the next wave of passive-aggressive retaliation. Someone dumped lawn clippings all over my driveway. Another time, my mailbox was knocked off its post, but I had cameras installed. And when I caught Karen's husband in the act of trespassing and removing one of my signs, I filed a police report. The officer who arrived wasn't impressed when Karen showed up demanding they reconsider the case.
Oh.
I handed over the footage and said nothing. A week later, her husband was charged with misdemeanor trespassing and vandalism. I didn't push for jail time, just restitution and an apology. The apology never came, but the check did. And then came the vote. I wasn't even in the room when it happened. I was out fishing in my canoe, watching the sun go down over the water that had caused so much drama. My phone buzzed with texts. "It's done. She's out." Karen resigned before the final tally. It felt surreal. Just weeks ago, I had been painted as the villain, the rogue lake thief. Now, the woman who had declared war on me and indirectly on half the neighborhood was dethroned. The board appointed an interim president, one of the more level-headed members, who'd always seemed uncomfortable with Karen's reign of terror. He reached out the next day with a completely different tone. He thanked me for my patience, acknowledged the errors made by the HOA, and asked if we could work toward a formal agreement for shared lake access with rent, of course, in terms that respected my property rights.
Ow!
I said I'd consider it. But in truth, I wasn't done yet. Despite Karen's resignation and the tide finally turning in my favor, I knew better than to let my guard down. Now it doesn't just disappear, it finds new hosts. The interim HOA president, Mark, seemed friendly and more reasonable on the surface, but I caught subtle signs that some of Karen's former allies were trying to regroup. There were whispers at community gatherings, subtle glances at me from across driveways, and sudden policy suggestions floated in HOA newsletters, things like implementing mandatory shoreline maintenance contributions for all residents bordering the lake. That sounded suspiciously like another attempt to claw back control over what I owned. So instead of relaxing, I got proactive. I hired a land use attorney to conduct a full legal review of my lakeside property and all historical transactions tied to it. What she uncovered made everything up to that point look like child's play. Back in the 1980s, before the subdivision was even completed, The original land developer had filed an easement request that was never approved. That request would have given the HOA permission to build shared-use docks, but it was denied by the county due to improper environmental assessments. Somehow, decades later, the HOA had acted as though it had the green light anyway, constructing unauthorized docks and claiming ownership of the lake without any legal basis. That discovery was dynamite. With my attorney's help, I filed a formal notice to the HOA, demanding that all unpermitted structures on my property be either removed or legalized via a lease agreement. I wasn't trying to destroy the community AI. Simply wanted the law respected. Response was an emergency HOA meeting, hastily organized and emotionally charged. Residents who had long relied on those docks, many of whom had no idea the HOA lacked actual authority over the lake, were stunned. Some were angry, some confused, and a few were downright apologetic. I showed up this time, printed copies of the county maps and historical records in hand. I calmly explained the situation and offered a solution. If the HOA and residents wanted continued access to their docks, we could draw up rental contracts for a fair rate, with each homeowner paying a small fee to cover maintenance and legal costs. It would be cheaper than building new docks on the other side of the lake, and it would finally bring everything into compliance. But not everyone was on board. A woman named Linda, who had once served on the HOA board under Karen, stood up and accused me of corporate-style land grabbing. She claimed I was privatizing nature, despite the fact that the HOA had already done exactly that under false pretenses for years. Her speech sparked shouting matches across the room. It was clear that the community was divided not because of what I'd done, but because I had exposed the lies they'd all been living under. After the meeting, I received anonymous letters in my mailbox. One warned me to back off before things get worse. Another accused me of ruining the neighborhood's culture. But there were also thank you notes from people who had suffered under HOA fines, who now felt emboldened to speak up. One resident, a single mother named Holly, told me she had once been fined $500 for painting her garage door a slightly lighter shade of beige. She offered to help gather support and counter misinformation. I realized then that I wasn't just protecting my property, I was changing how the neighborhood functioned. And that made me a target again. The next escalation came quietly. Morning, I woke up to find several of my dock boards torn up and scattered across the shoreline. My cameras hadn't caught anyone. Someone had cleverly snuck in through the water during the early hours. I reported the vandalism, but there was little the police could do without identifying a suspect. My insurance covered the repairs, but I wasn't content to sit idle. I upgraded my security system to include lake-facing motion sensors and infrared night vision cameras. So next time someone tried anything, I'd have them on tape. Meanwhile, Mark, the interim president, reached out again. He seemed nervous, probably sensing the pressure from both sides. He asked if I'd be willing to attend a neutral mediation with the HOA to settle the lake dispute once and for all. I agreed, on the condition that the meeting be recorded and include a representative from the county zoning office. They hesitated, but eventually agreed. The mediation took place in the community clubhouse. I sat across from 3 HOA board members, including Linda and a lawyer they'd recently retained. On my side were my attorney and the county official. The HOA argued that, while the legal ownership of the lake was technically mine, they had decades of established community use, and that removing access would cause irreparable hardship to dozens of families. I countered with records showing the use had always been unauthorized, and that I had offered multiple legal avenues for continued access, all of which they had refused. The county rep backed me up, stating that historical use without proper easements did not override property rights. The HOA's lawyer finally conceded that point, and we reached a tentative agreement. The HOA would pay an annual fee for dock use, maintain insurance, and formally recognize my ownership. It wasn't a victory dance moment, but it was something. Solid, the board agreed to take the proposal to a community vote. That vote would decide whether the HOA would accept the lease terms or remove the docks altogether. The announcement triggered a flurry of activity in the neighborhood. Flyers went up, both for and against the proposal. The local Facebook group lit up with debates. I watched from the sidelines, letting the facts speak for themselves. I wasn't. Begging for approval, I was enforcing the truth, and it paid off. On the night of the vote, the clubhouse was packed again. Residents filed in, cast their ballots, and waited. When the final count was read aloud, the results stunned even me. 78% voted in favor of signing the lease agreement. The HOA would pay for access, and I would allow dock use under legal terms. The cheers were loud, and I saw genuine relief on many faces, but not everyone clapped. Linda stormed out without saying a word, and a few of Karen's old guard looked like they had swallowed sour milk. I didn't care. The majority had spoken. The community had chosen law, order, and compromise over chaos. That night, as I stood on my newly repaired dock, watching the moon ripple across the water, I felt something I hadn't felt since moving in peace. But even then, deep down, I knew the story wasn't over. Even after the overwhelming vote in favor of the lease agreement, I knew the calm wouldn't last long. I could feel it in the strange silences during morning walks, in the way some neighbors avoided eye contact, and in the cryptic social media posts that floated around the neighborhood's group pages. Though the community at large had voted with reason, the few who had been so deeply entrenched in the HOA's illusion of control still saw me as the enemy. That resentment began surfacing in increasingly bizarre ways. Someone reported my landscaping lights to the county, claiming they violated environmental ordinances. Then, another anonymous complaint accused me of polluting the lake with unapproved fertilizers from my backyard garden. Each claim was dismissed quickly. The volume of these petty reports made it clear that I was being targeted. It's not for anything I had done wrong, but simply for standing my ground. I wasn't going to play defense forever. I had learned that the best way to protect what was mine was through transparency and community outreach. So I launched what I called the Lakefront Stewardship Initiative, a monthly open invitation for anyone in the neighborhood to join me for a walk along the shoreline, inspect the docks, discuss water quality concerns, and even enjoy some barbecue afterward. It was informal, but consistent, and people showed up. Slowly, new faces appeared, and not just those who had voted in my favor. Some of the more skeptical neighbors were curious enough to hear me out. I let them ask questions, made no big speeches, and showed them exactly how I was maintaining the lake, not restricting it. By the third month, even a few previous critics were bringing their kids along to fish from the dock during these gatherings. But not everyone was happy with my growing goodwill. One night, I received a hand-delivered letter on my doorstep, no postage, no envelope, just a folded sheet of paper with the words, "You'll regret this," scrawled across it in red marker. My security system upgraded after the earlier dock. Vandalism had caught a figure walking briskly up to my porch around 2:47 a.m., hoodie up, face hidden. I handed the footage over to the sheriff's department, but with no clear ID, the investigation stalled. I didn't let it rattle me, but I did take it seriously. I posted about it in the neighborhood forum, not to point fingers, but to make it clear that I wouldn't be intimidated. The response was mixed. Some neighbors expressed concern, others said nothing, but the message was sent. I wasn't going anywhere. Then came the next big twist. The county announced an environmental inspection sweep across all privately owned lakes following a series of fish die-offs in a nearby town. Inspectors would be reviewing every water system connected to community developments, including mine. It should have been a routine check, but once again, someone in the HOA saw it as an opportunity. Unbeknownst to me, a few disgruntled residents had submitted evidence to the county claiming my section of the lake had been suffering from contamination ever since I took over. They attached old photos of algae blooms, selectively framed to exclude timestamps, trying to paint a picture of neglect. When the county team showed up, I welcomed them, offered access to all relevant records, and gave them a timeline of my water treatments, dock repairs, air, and even shared third-party lab test results, showing that the lake had actually improved in quality over the last year. After a thorough 2-day inspection, the lead inspector called me personally to say there was no issue, and in fact, my property had better maintenance records than most of the HOA-managed zones. Once again, the smear campaign had failed. I wanted to know who was behind it. I filed a public records request to access the submitted complaints. The names weren't redacted, and there it was, Linda, along with two of her close allies from the old board. It was clear they weren't just bitter, they were actively trying to undermine me using the very system they used to weaponize against others. I could have sued for defamation, maybe even filed harassment charges, but I decided on something more effective: exposure. I gathered the documents, scanned them, shared them during the next Lakefront stewardship event, which now had over 24 regular attendees, including members of the current HOA board. I told them the truth, not with rage or drama, but with calm clarity. I let the documents speak for themselves. The shift in the crowd was immediate. People weren't just angry, they were ashamed. Linda's actions reflected poorly on the entire neighborhood, and the board knew it. The following week, at the HOA's quarterly meeting, Mark announced that Linda and her associates had been formally removed from all committees and would be barred from participating in any leadership roles for the next 5 years. That was a stronger punishment than I had even hoped for. For the first time, it felt like real accountability had arrived. After the meeting, Mark approached me. He looked exhausted, the kind of tired you get after months of navigating impossible politics. He extended a hand and said, "You were right from the beginning. We were wrong to come at you the way we did. I hope we can start working together, not just around the lake, but for the entire community." I shook his hand. That moment marked a turning point, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt bullied or unheard in this neighborhood. The story wasn't about one man fighting an HOA anymore. It was about an entire system being forced to reckon with its misuse of power. From that day on, the lake became more than just water and land. It became a symbol of boundary, ownership, transparency, and most of all, resistance against blind authority. I still monitored the shoreline every morning, still kept backup footage and logs. But now, when I walked the dock, I was greeted by neighbors with waves instead of whispers. Fishermen showed up early, families picnicked nearby, and kids dipped their toes in without fear. It wasn't perfect. There were still politics, still complaints here and there. But the lake was mine, and now, in a way, it belonged to everyone who had chosen truth over fear. Still deep in my gut, I knew this. Victory would invite one last act of desperation, and I'd be ready for it. Things had quieted down for a while. It's almost to the point where I thought maybe, just maybe, the chaos had settled into history. A hard-fought lesson absorbed by the community. But peace in an HOA war zone is a dangerous illusion, and the silence that followed the disciplinary action against Linda and her allies was not an end, but a coiling tension waiting to snap. It happened early one Saturday morning. A strange knock woke me before dawn, persistent and deliberate. I opened the door to find Deputy Rawlings, the same officer who had once helped me identify the dock's saboteurs. He looked grim. "Sir, we received a report from your HOA this morning. They claim your dock extension violates the new shoreline regulation they passed last quarter." I blinked at him. "You mean the regulation they quietly tried to pass without notifying the affected property owners?" He nodded. "Not enforceable, but they're making noise at the county level. I thought you should know before it escalates." I thanked him, but this wasn't just another rule dispute. It was a move meant to stir trouble again. I pulled out the HOA's latest newsletter. Buried in page 4 was a mention of a new environmental compliance clause, suggesting a 3-foot limit for private dock extensions into the lake. My dock was 5 feet, installed over a decade. I go by the previous owner and approved at the time. It had even been featured in the community brochure when they tried to market the lake as a premier fishing spot. Now, it was supposedly non-compliant. I immediately contacted the county land use office. The agent I spoke with, Sandra, reviewed the clause and chuckled. "They can't supersede your property deed or previous zoning approvals. There. Regulation isn't binding." Still, I knew the goal wasn't legality, it was agitation. To counter, I requested an official written declaration from the county, confirming that my dock was grandfathered in under earlier codes and legally exempt. Once I had it in hand, I didn't just file it away, printed copies and brought them to the next HOA meeting, which I knew Linda, though banned from leadership, would attend in the back like a phantom hoping to haunt the room. I distributed the documents and read a short, composed statement. Let this serve as a reminder that weaponizing vague regulations against individual residents is a violation of not only good governance, but the integrity of our shared space. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was firm, and that meant more to me. That evening, I received an unexpected email from Mark, the HOA president. He asked if I'd consider serving on a newly proposed lake use committee, an advisory group made up of both HOA board members and independent residents. It wasn't a power grab, it was a bridge. I accepted. For the next 3 months, I found myself in meetings I never thought I'd tolerate, sitting across from people who once saw me as a threat. But now, the dynamic had shifted. I brought data charts showing water quality, charts showing dock maintenance budgets, proof of increased property values since we opened up the lake for community engagement events. At first, the conversations were tense, but eventually they turned productive. One night, after a long session planning next summer's lakeside events, Mark looked at me and said, "You know, I don't think this community ever needed control. It needed stewardship." That line stuck with me. But just as we started making real progress, it happened. One final attempt to drag me under. A breaking news alert on my phone announced a contaminated lake spill in our zip code. I raced. Outside, emergency services were already arriving. Neighbors stood clustered along the shoreline, some filming with their phones, others panicking. The water near the HOA dock had turned a sickly brown-green. Fish floated belly up, and a smell like rotting vegetation filled the air. Someone shouted, "This is his fault. He's been running his own chemical treatments." I turned and saw a new resident, red-faced, pointing at me with more fear than rage. I didn't respond. I ran to my dock, grabbed the lockbox holding my treatment logs and lab reports, and sprinted to the emergency coordinator. "Everything I've used is organic and county approved," I said, opening the binder. She flipped through it and nodded slowly. Meanwhile, another inspector tested the water near my dock. "This isn't from your property," she said after a few minutes. "It's coming from the storm runoff connected to the HOA. It maintained drainage pipes." The crowd fell quiet. I looked up to see Linda near the back, frozen, as her own son whispered something in her ear, then turned and walked away from her. It was over. Not just this incident, but the war itself. Because in that moment, the entire neighborhood saw the truth firsthand. The contamination had come from neglect by those who wanted control without responsibility. The county issued a full report the following week, confirmed that the spill was caused by clogged filters in the HOA's outdated storm management system. The cost of cleanup would be covered by their insurance, but the damage to their reputation was irreparable. And with that, I was asked to lead a full audit of all HOA environmental practices. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same man they once tried to push out was now tasked with keeping their house in order. I accepted, not for power, but for peace. The lake slowly returned to normal over the next month. Wildlife returned, families came back with picnic baskets and paddleboards. One morning, as I walked the dock, I found a note tucked under a stone. It read, "Thank you for protecting what matters no name, which is gratitude." I stood there, watching the sunrise break over the water, reflecting on everything that had happened. The HOA had stormed in when I moved here, thinking they could claim my lake. But they never realized until it was far too late that I had. Something they never did, the community's trust. And in the end, that was the real power. The morning after the environmental audit report went public, I woke to a stack of mail and a driveway full of neighbors wanting answers. Handshakes and, surprisingly, apologies. The transformation of the neighborhood sentiment was like a switch. Had flipped suddenly. People who once stood behind the HOA's arbitrary decisions were standing beside me, grateful that someone had fought back, not with hostility, but with law, patience, and facts. The lake, which once symbolized division, now symbolized renewal, and I felt a new kind of responsibility weighing on my shoulders, not just to defend my property, but to protect this fragile balance we had earned. Still, it wasn't all applause. In progress. The remnants of Linda's influence remained embedded in certain corners of the HOA, like mildew beneath old paint. An anonymous email was circulated to the neighborhood accusing me of using my new environmental oversight role for personal gain, claiming that I was approving shoreline permits in exchange for favors and had intentions of privatizing a section of the lakefront for a future boathouse business. It was absurd. I don't even own a boat. But the smear campaign gained enough traction that Mark, now deeply invested in keeping the peace, asked for a formal investigation, not because he believed it, but to silence the conspiracy with transparency. I welcomed it. HOA board hired an independent auditor, a sharp woman named Felicia, from a firm based 2 counties over. She showed up with a thick binder and a voice that carried the confidence of someone who had seen every HOA trick in the book. I gave her everything: my emails, my reports, even security footage showing my interactions with permit applicants. 3 days later, she submitted her findings at a special meeting attended by nearly every resident in the community. Her presentation was brief and devastating to my accusers. There is no evidence of misconduct. In fact, she said, flipping to the final slide, "This is one of the most thorough and legally sound environmental stewardship operations I've seen in any HOA I've audited." The applause this time was louder, longer, and it drowned out the quiet shuffling of people leaving, early, likely the ones who had fueled the baseless accusations. After the meeting, Felicia approached me and said, "You ever thought about consulting for other communities?" I laughed, not entirely dismissing the idea. The quiet that followed in the coming days was different than before. It was not the uneasy calm before another storm, but the stillness of resolution. I received a formal apology letter from the HOA board, and though Linda never signed it, her signature absence was its own form of concession. A few weeks later, the HOA hosted its first truly public lakefront barbecue, open to all residents without any of the ridiculous restrictions they used to enforce: no wristbands, no patrolling, golf carts, no dock permits required to sit and fish. Families mingled freely, kids ran barefoot through the grass, and I stood near the edge of the water talking to Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly woman who'd lived 2 houses down since the early 70s. She told me she hadn't seen this kind of gathering since before the HOA was even formed. "You didn't just fix the lake, dear," she said softly. "You fixed us." And yet, despite the peace, a small part of me stayed alert. HOA power structures tend to regenerate like weeds. Just because one vine had been trimmed didn't mean another wouldn't creep up elsewhere. So I proposed a change. Working with Mark and a few other like-minded residents, we drafted a new charter amendment. No HOA board action could impact any body of water without full community vote and independent ecological review. It passed overwhelmingly. That small sentence in the charter meant that no matter who sat on the board next year, 5 years from now, or after I was gone, the lake couldn't be touched without real accountability. The real twist came when Mark, after announcing he would not seek re-election due to a job transfer, nominated me to run for HOA president. The room was quiet when he said it, then murmurs followed, and then hands started raising in support. I hadn't planned on this, but I realized that sometimes leadership doesn't come from ambition. It comes from necessity. I accepted not because I wanted power, but because I'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop the system from turning against people was to get inside and rebuild the gears. My first act as president was to disband the secretive docks. Committee Linda had once run, replacing it with an open community task force, where every lakefront owner could contribute. My second act was symbolic but meaningful. I renamed the community newsletter from the Harbor Watch to the Lake Voice. It may have seemed small, but it signaled something bigger: that the era of top-down directives was over. That spring, we hosted the first ever Lake Cleanup and Celebration Day, complete with canoe races, a local jazz band, and free hot dogs. It was funded by donations from residents who believed in what we were building, not from dues or forced assessments. The HOA wasn't just tolerable. Now it was something people were starting to be proud of. Linda, she stayed quiet mostly. Occasionally, I'd see her walking alone, near the walking trail. Not angry, not plotting, just alone. I wondered if she regretted how much she'd lost trying to claim power she never actually understood. One evening, just before sunset, I stood at the end of my dock again, looking out over the water, now calm and full of life. Ducks nested near the reeds, fish jumped in the silver light, and kids played on the floating platforms we'd installed for summer swimming. My neighbor Henry approached, holding 2 beers. "You ever think about selling and moving to a normal neighborhood?" he asked, half joking. I laughed and took one. "This is a normal neighborhood now," I said. He raised his bottle, and we toasted to everything we had survived. But deep down, I knew one more surprise could still be waiting, and it would arrive sooner than anyone expected. Just when I thought the battle was over, and peace had firmly settled over the neighborhood, a certified letter landed in my mailbox one late afternoon, stamped with a state government seal. Inside was a notice from the Department of Water Rights, triggered by an anonymous complaint alleging that I had illegally impeded HOA dock access by exerting personal ownership over a public waterway. At first, I nearly laughed it off. After all, the lake and the easements had been clearly documented as part of my private property, but the letter mentioned something that froze me: a newly introduced state bill proposing that lakes exceeding 10 acres, even if privately owned, might be classified as shared environmental assets, allowing HOA-like entities limited governance under environmental unity clauses. I had never heard of such legislation, and the fact that it seemed to directly align with the vendetta Linda once tried to pursue gave me pause. I knew she wasn't going to go underground waiting. Over the next few days, I dove into legal research, reached out to a property rights attorney, and learned that the bill had been quietly pushed by a senator whose political donors included a group of HOA lobbyists. The pieces clicked together. This wasn't about my lake hit. It was a test run to see how far legislation could push private boundaries for collective control. It was the HOA's last-ditch effort to regain the upper hand, not through local power, but state interference. I wasn't about to roll over. I called for an emergency HOA meeting and laid everything out for the community, showing how the new bill could not only jeopardize my lake, but also set a precedent to impact everyone's property rights across the state. For once, it wasn't just my battle. The room lit up with fear and fury, and we formed a coalition residents. Other HOA presidents from neighboring counties and property rights advocates ready to take this to the state capitol. I wrote articles, recorded interviews, and launched a campaign called Protect What You Own, using real stories from our community to show what overreach looked like. We weren't alone. Support surged online. Donations flowed in. And when the bill finally came to the floor, hundreds of us showed up, many wearing shirts printed with the phrase, "My dock, my rules." We filled the hearing room and overflowed. Into the hallways, one by one, we gave testimony. I stood up last. "This isn't just about a dock," I said. "It's about the right to protect what you build, what you care for, and what you own. And if they take my lake today, they'll take your backyard tomorrow." The room erupted in applause. The vote was close, but the bill was struck down. The moment the announcement was made, I felt a decade's worth of weight lift off my shoulders. That night, I returned home to find candles lit along the shoreline. Dozens of neighbors had gathered for an impromptu celebration. Mark was back from his job transfer temporarily and handed me a small wooden plaque that read "The Lake Keeper." It was cheesy, but in the best way. Even Linda showed up silent, standing in the back, watching. And this time, she didn't look angry, just defeated. Maybe, finally, she understood that the lake was never about power or control. It was about people, community, responsibility. Over the next year, things only improved. The lake became a model of environmental preservation and responsible access. And our HOA earned a regional award for transparency and reform. I gave up the HOA presidency a year later, confident that it no longer needed a warrior, just a neighbor. I returned to my dock more often, not to plan or to fight, but just to breathe. To watch the sun set over water I had once nearly lost. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd hear the sound of kids laughing on the docks, boats drifting in the distance, and I'd smile. knowing that the HOA storm that tried to take everything from me had only strengthened the roots I planted here. But remember, there's always another HOA somewhere, always another Linda ready to rise. So if they come for your lake, your land, or your peace, be ready to fight smart, fight legal, and never ever back down. Because in the end, it's not just your property, it's your legacy. If you enjoyed this unbelievable journey from HOA overreach to dockside justice, don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories on YouTube for more real HOA drama, shocking twists, and endings you'll never see coming. Hit the bell icon, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's next.